When you started down that path, what were some of the first challenges that you faced? And I know we've talked before about your view of an inside out approach versus an outside in approach. Could you talk about some of the challenges you faced and how that mindset either helped or hurt your company?
Well, I think back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the pharmaceutical industry had not yet broken through in terms of the unpacking of biology that we now have enjoyed in the last 10, 15 years. The Human Genome Project was still going. We didn't understand the genetic basis of disease as well as we do now. We didn't understand some of the pharmacology that we now understand. But yet we were very technology-led as an industry. Large companies with large research laboratories inventing, still more molecules for targets that were not very user-friendly, if you like, more to do with what could we do in the laboratory rather than what would we do in the doctor's office or the patient's home. And so it's always been, as an industry, since it came out of chemistry, a left to right industry for the large part. The research guys have to come up with something wizard, and then the regulatory guys have to get it approved, and the marketing people then have to pick up take on the baton and market it. And that left to right thinking, which is essentially what I think you mean by, inside out, I think got us some part way to solving some of the big healthcare problems of our age, but ultimately is very limited because you're not really solving the problems that are out there. So the whole industry, I think, has gone through this cycle and continues to struggle with the technology lead rather than the sort of mindset of, well, what do we really need to get done here in healthcare?
That leaves it largely innovation to luck, right? Because you have to discover the molecule that's going to achieve the outcomes that you're trying to achieve without knowing the outcomes you're trying to achieve, right? So it's kind of putting the cart before the horse. I always felt that drug discovery was kind of a guessing game, right? Where you're coming up with solutions and then seeing if they can solve a problem. Was there a particular moment that you realized that there must be a better way to go about this process?
I'm not sure there was one moment, but there was a good story around a moment. I was utterly intrigued by what Boeing were doing with document management systems at the time. I was heading up a chunk of Roche, and I got myself invited to Seattle to go and see them. And I was there for 3 days. And indeed, they did have good document management systems that I was very interested in bringing across to the pharma company that I was working in. However, on the second day, I was having lunch in the staff canteen, and I was introduced to an engineer from Germany who actually worked for Lufthansa. My assumption at the beginning was that he was, like me, a visitor, until I found out in the conversation that he was actually in Seattle for 5 years with his family, embedded in a program of engineering at Boeing as sort of a real life problem solver, trying to think through with the Boeing team, what the real world problems would be. So while obviously Boeing is a brilliant technology company and have led the world for many, many years, the idea to me that we could perhaps involve people who make big decisions in solving real problems into teams might be important. But still today, pharma doesn't do that. It's very difficult to do. We still are thinking a lot of the time left to right. It's much better than it was. I think our industry has progressed dramatically in the last 25 years, but there's still a tendency to come up with a wizard technology idea and then figure out whether there's a market for it.
Yeah. Well, you did things differently at the medicines company, and you use that outside in or right to left mindset, and that's a big shift in mindset. What were some of the challenges that you faced and that the organization faced as you try to move them from left to right to that right to left mindset?
Well, there were some things that Big Pharma has always done extremely well, and we didn't have any of those advantages to bring with us. For example, scale, low-cost capital, and lots of it, global reach, massive technology capabilities. So I missed all of those things day one, and it was quite clear that we would have to develop those capabilities on a much smaller scale. But on the other hand, that did provide an advantage because we had to find a way to look at our business model, which was to take strategic misfits from big pharma. There are many assets in big pharma portfolios that are not suitable because of their scale and size and the way they work. And we thought that we might be able to take some of those assets by licensing them in, develop them, and then enjoy the growth that you could drive from them. And that's what we did. So but of course, we moved into the hospital business at a time when big pharma was moving out of the hospital business. And I think our creation of a company, growth of the company, was gratifying. It could never quite be on the scale of a big pharma company, but our ability to take a blank sheet of paper and ask the question, for example, in the cardiac cath lab where we really cut our teeth, what really needs doing here, was a fascinating one. There were technologies, for example, for blood thinners that could lower the chances of a patient having another heart attack during their heart attack procedure. And these were very powerful blood thinners. And everybody wanted them to be ever more powerful. The technology should be more and more. It's sort of like the steam shovel story of Christensen or something, or discs storage. Everybody wanted a more and more potent drug to get more and more thinning of the blood quicker and quicker. But what people had forgotten was that the real problem of managing patients with heart attacks is speed and throughput, and the ability to get them out of the OR, out of the recovery unit quickly. So we knew that, and we knew that the big impediment to that was actually bleeding, which is the safety problem, not an efficacy problem. And so we focused the development of a product called Angiomax onto what would it take to give adequate blood thinning fast. I mean, we were not giving up on that idea, but in a way which really changed the outcomes of the patients and the hospital's process, which was getting them done quickly, mobilizing the patient quickly, not having them bleed, and obviously, therefore, improving the patient's outlook. It turned out that bleeding was an incredibly high risk factor for further death risk. It turned out to be that bleeding was more important than having another heart attack in terms of your survival. But then in addition, for the institution caring for the patient, that their throughput would be improved. I remember going to a very busy hospital in Kentucky pretty early on in this and sitting down with some nurses who were staffing the unit that was caring for these patients as they came out of their angioplasty and went into recovery and then back to the normal ward before often being discharged the same day. And what the nurses talked about was the cumbersome nature of the post-operative care. Patients were still on infusions. Patients had to be observed very carefully because their blood thinners were still working for several hours. We solved that sort of problem by engineering very short half-life drug, by studying very carefully the throughput of patients so that the improvement in performance came from a completely unexpected area because we were thinking about outcomes rather than inputs. We had every bit as good protection against that second heart attack, but we could get the patient treated more quickly, more safely, which was very novel. As a consequence, we entered the market fourth with Angiomax against some very, very formidable competitors with excellent drugs. And I think within 5 years, we had 70% market share. It became the number one selling drug in US hospitals for many, many years. And really drove the growth of the medicines company into an entity that investors thought was worth investing in.